You are rearranging your spice rack on a Saturday afternoon when your phone buzzes with a calendar reminder for a dentist appointment you made 4 months ago and forgot about. And this small administrative failure, the kind that used to be absorbed by a life full enough to generate its own bureaucracy, strikes you as a reasonable symbol for what the past 8 months have been. Since the agency closed, you have had too much time for your spice rack and not enough time for the things that make a spice rack irrelevant, which is work, which is money, which is the forward motion of a life that has stalled in the specific way of lives whose financial foundations are removed abruptly and without much ceremony. You were a copywriter at a mid-sized creative agency for 4 years. The agency was acquired. The acquiring company had its own creative team. You were given a box, a severance check representing 6 weeks of your salary, and a handshake from an HR person you'd never met. This is a story that has been told before and will be told again, and knowing that does not make your version of it feel less specifically yours. The 8 months since have been shaped by a combination of rejection, near misses, and the particular erosion of confidence that comes from repeatedly presenting yourself to a market that keeps returning you. You have freelanced intermittently, 2 small projects, a product description rewrite for a company whose product you couldn't get excited about, a social media calendar for a restaurant that paid late and not in full, and you have applied for positions with a consistency that has not yet produced results in the right category. You have dipped into savings that were not deep enough for the dipping. Your rent is $1,300 a month. You have $600 left. You have told yourself for 3 months that something in your field will appear and you will take it, and nothing in your field has appeared. And $600 is not a number that allows philosophical selectivity. The job listing appears on a general jobs board rather than a creative industry board, which is itself information about what you've begun to accept. Administrative coordinator, a property management company called Vantage Group, full-time, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5:30, salary $38,000. The duties listed include scheduling, correspondence management, document preparation, client communication, and general office support. There is a line at the bottom that says opportunity for growth within a dynamic team, which is a sentence that no longer means anything to you after 8 months of job listings, but which you read anyway with the vestigial optimism of someone who has not quite finished hoping. You apply. You get an interview. The interview is in a beige office on the 7th floor of a building that smells like recycled air and carpet cleaner, and the hiring manager, a woman named Diane, whose manner suggests she has conducted many interviews and found most of them sufficient but not memorable, asks you standard questions that you answer in the language of administrative competence and organizational skill, neither of which is false and neither of which represents anything you'd have described as your identity 3 years ago. She offers you the position at the end of the week. You accept it the same day. $600 has a way of accelerating decisions. The first morning you arrive 9 minutes early, which feels like the right margin professional without performative, and you are shown to your desk by a woman named Pretty who does onboarding in the same efficient, slightly apologetic way of people who have done it enough times to know it is both necessary and tedious. The desk is in an open plan area with 7 other desks, 4 of which are occupied when you arrive. Your computer has a wallpaper of a generic mountain landscape that you will not change for 3 weeks because changing the wallpaper feels like a declaration of permanence that you're not yet ready to make. Your email inbox has 400 unread messages forwarded from your predecessor, which you will spend the better part of your first week processing with the specific patience of someone diffusing something that was left armed. Pretty shows you the filing system, the shared calendar, the phone extension directory, the company's documentation templates, and the coffee machine, which requires a specific sequence to produce the desired result and which nobody has documented. So Pretty shows you once, and you take notes in the small notebook you brought for this purpose, which is the most prepared you've ever been for a coffee machine and which reflects the particular care of someone entering a new environment with inadequate confidence. Your direct supervisor is a man named Richard who manages the office operations and who reports to the 2 founding partners whose names are on the building directory and whose presence in the open plan area is infrequent, and when it occurs produces a subtle adjustment in the atmosphere, a collective slight increase in apparent industry, the way a school corridor behaves differently when a teacher appears at the end of it. Richard is in his early 40s and has the particular manner of someone who was once the most capable person at a certain level and was promoted to a level where that original capability is less relevant than the new skills. The level requires, and who has responded to this mismatch by compensating with procedural thoroughness. He likes process. He documents process. He sends emails about process and follows up on those emails with verbal confirmations, and occasionally follows up the verbal confirmations with calendar invites titled Process Check-in, which are meetings that could be emails, which are themselves emails that could be one-line Slack messages, which is the organizational physics of a workplace that has developed administrative weight in excess of its actual complexity. Your salary, $38,000, comes to approximately $2,400 a month after taxes and the health insurance deduction that you have taken because the alternative is being uninsured, which is a risk management decision made easier by the memory of $600 in a checking account. $2,400 a month minus $1,300 in rent leaves $1,100 for everything else, which is not comfortable and is not crisis, which is the income band you've been operating in for most of your adult life, and which you've concluded is less a function of your choices than of the economy's structure, though you revisit this conclusion periodically and each time arrive at the same place with slightly less certainty about what it means. You pay your rent. You pay your phone. You buy groceries with the attention of someone who is not poor and is not fine. This is where you are. The work is not hard in the way of physically demanding work. You sit, you type, you manage the calendar for the two partners, which requires a specific skill that turns out to be less about scheduling and more about the politics of scheduling. Which meetings take precedence over which clients can be asked to shift and which cannot. How to phrase a rescheduling request so that it sounds like consideration for the client's time rather than an internal conflict you're resolving at their expense. You draft correspondence in a voice that is not yours, but that you learn quickly, the formal but warm register of property management communications, which has its own grammar of reassurance and deflection, and the gentle management of expectations. You prepare documents from templates, which is the work that most directly resembles the operational definition of administrative coordination, and which you can do well and quickly, which means you finish it more quickly than you should, which means you learn early that the job requires the management of time as carefully as the management of tasks, because finishing ahead of pace draws attention in a way that finishing on pace does not. The colleagues are people you will know for the duration of this job with a specific kind of knowing well enough to understand their professional habits and preferences and moods, not well enough to know their outside lives with any depth. There is Marcus at the desk diagonally from yours who handles tenant communications and who has a laugh that works against the open plan's ambient solemnity approximately 4 times a day. There is Jenny, who is the office manager above your pay grade and below Richard's, and who navigates this middle position with the diplomatic competence of someone who has been doing it for a long time and who has developed opinions about Richard that she expresses only through the strategic silence of someone who knows the organization well enough to know which silences are safe. There is a rotating cast of property managers who work partly in the field and partly at the remaining desks, who exist in the office as whether sometimes present, sometimes not, producing conditions you adjust to without expecting continuity. You exist among these people as one more element of the open plan's ecosystem, specific and unremarkable, which is the social position that administrative work produces in most organizations and which you have decided to find neutral rather than diminishing, though the decision requires periodic renewal. Richard's management style reveals itself fully around the end of the 3rd week, when the quarterly reporting cycle begins. The quarterly reports are documents that consolidate data from the property manager's individual reports into summary presentations for the partners, and they are your responsibility, which means they were your predecessor's responsibility, which means there is a template and a process and a set of expectations that you are inheriting rather than designing, and that the inheriting has not come with adequate documentation, and that Richard's process orientation, which seemed like thorough management in the first 2 weeks, turns out to be thorough management of processes he already understands, and notably less helpful with processes that require you to understand something new. He sends you the previous quarter's completed report as a reference. He says model it on that. He does not explain 3 data sources that the previous report references. which you discover are three different internal systems with three different login processes and three different export formats that require reconciliation before they can be entered into the report template. You spend 2 days figuring this out through a combination of asking Marcus, who knows one of the systems, searching the shared drive for documentation that half exists in a folder nobody has updated since the previous quarter, and trial and error with the systems themselves. You produce the report correctly and on time. Richard reviews it and says good, and the partners receive it, and nothing further is said. And you understand that this is the reward structure of administrative work. The absence of negative feedback is the positive feedback, and you file this understanding in the same place. You file everything you've learned about working inside other people's systems. The emails are continuous. Not a surge and a lull, but a continuous stream that modulates in volume by the hour and by the day, but never fully stops. Because the company operates across 47 properties in 3 metropolitan areas, and every property generates correspondence at some rate, and all of it routes through the office to be processed, assigned, or responded to. You develop triage, which is the only way to manage continuous input by category, by urgency, by who needs to know and who needs to act, and whether the person who needs to act is you or someone else, and whether the handoff requires a note or can be accomplished by forward alone. You become fast at this, faster than your predecessor was. You infer from the backlog's timestamp distribution. Speed in this context is not a reward, it is simply a condition that produces more input, because the faster the triage, the more the system routes toward you, which is the administrative equivalent of being promoted to a higher level of the same work without the compensation that promotion implies. There is a client named Robert Hargreaves who is the managing partner of a company that leases 2 floors and one of Vantage's commercial properties, and who contacts the office with a frequency and a specificity that suggest he views the administrative function as a personal concierge service for grievances. He calls about temperatures. He calls about an elevator that was out of service for 4 hours on a Tuesday. He calls about a neighboring tenant's deliveries that he believes are being staged in a common area that he feels entitled to with a conviction inversely proportional to the documentation supporting it. He is not violent and is not irrational, but has the quality of someone who has learned that persistence with service organizations produces results, and who has applied this lesson to all of his interactions with Vantage with thoroughness of someone who has nothing better to do, which, given that he manages a company of 30 people, is puzzling, and which you stop trying to explain after the 4th call. You take his calls, you take notes, you escalate where escalation is warranted, and you absorb where it isn't, which means you tell him you'll look into it, and you follow up when you said you would. And sometimes the follow-up produces a resolution, and sometimes it produces another call from Robert a week later about a related issue, and you take that call too, because he is a client and you are the person who answers the client calls. And the fact that he is unreasonable is not a category the job recognizes as grounds for a different response. You develop a tone for Robert's calls that is consistent and even, and that costs you about 15% more effort per call than an average call costs, which is the toll his persistence levies, and you pay it. The 5th month brings a reorganization of the office responsibilities that is announced in an all-staff meeting by Richard in the language of optimization and efficiency, and that in practice means 2 things. The office manager, Jenny, is being given additional responsibilities in the field side of operations, which is presented as an opportunity for growth, and those responsibilities that Jenny is vacating are being distributed among the existing administrative staff, which is not presented as anything at all, just listed, just the new configuration stated as if the reconfiguration were a weather event rather than a decision. Your new responsibilities include oversight of the vendor contracts, the cleaning services, the maintenance contractors, the lift service agreements, which involves a set of annual reviews and renewal processes that Jenny has been managing for 3 years, and which is not documented anywhere with any completeness, because Jenny knew it well enough not to need documentation. You sit with Jenny for 2 afternoons before her responsibilities formally transfer, and she shows you the systems and the timelines and the specific vendor relationships that require management. The one contractor who needs 2 weeks notice for any service change. The cleaning company whose contract has a renewal window that runs 6 weeks earlier than its annual date. the lift company that has a warranty clause that Jenny has invoked twice, and which Richard does not know she's invoked, and which you file in the category of institutional knowledge that exists beneath the documented layer. You take notes with the attention of someone who understands that the notes are all they'll have once the meeting is over. There is no pay adjustment for the additional responsibilities. You are aware of this. You decide to raise it with Richard at the right moment, which requires you to identify the right moment, which requires learning Richard's pattern well enough to know when he is most receptive to operational conversations, as opposed to defensive ones, which takes about 2 weeks to map. You raise it, you frame it in the language of understanding the compensation structure and whether the new responsibilities place you in a different band. Richard says it's a good question, and he'll discuss it with the partners. You wait 3 weeks. Nothing. You ask again, with the patience of someone who has read the situation clearly enough to know that impatience here costs more than waiting. Richard says the partners have decided to hold compensation reviews until the annual cycle in 4 months. You say thank you for letting me know. You do the vendor contracts, you manage Robert Hargreaves' calls. You produce the quarterly report, you keep your triage current. This is what the job asks, and you provide what the job asks, because the job provides what the month requires, and the month is not yet at the point where this exchange is impossible to accept. The annual cycle arrives. You have been here 11 months. Your performance review is conducted by Richard in a small conference room, which signals formality, and Richard produces a document that has been filled in before the meeting rather than during it, which means the conversation is about confirming rather than assessing, and you recognize this and you participate accordingly. He says your performance has been strong across all categories. He says your handling of the vendor contracts has been excellent given that you took them on mid-year with minimal transition time. He says the partners have noted your client communication skills positively, which you understand to be a reference to Robert Hargreaves, whose calls have not produced a single escalation in 11 months. He then tells you the salary adjustment, which is 3%, which on $38,000 is $1140 a year, which is $95 a month, which is a number you had prepared yourself for by researching industry averages for the position and knowing the company's size and the current economic climate, and which you had decided in advance you would not react to visibly, because visible reaction to a salary adjustment in a performance review produces only 2 outcomes: discomfort without resolution, or the specific vulnerability of having shown your hand to someone who doesn't have to act on it. You say thank you. You sign the review document. You go back to your desk and you open your email and you process the morning's queue. And the afternoon continues. You tell a friend from your agency days about the raise at dinner that week, and she makes a face that is sympathetic and also slightly superior in the way of people whose professional situations are currently better than yours and who are aware that this could reverse and who show that awareness by performing sympathy while also performing a mild superiority that they haven't fully chosen. It just leaks. She says, you should look for something else. You say, you know. You say, it's more complicated than that. She says, isn't it always? You split the bill evenly and you go home and you think about looking for something else with the same energy you've had for this question since month 4, which is a real energy and an energy that has not yet produced a result. And this gap between the energy and the result is something you sit with more often than you'd like. The thing about office work that is different from the things people say about office work is that the difficulty is not boredom, or not only boredom, or not boredom, in the straightforward sense of nothing happening. The difficulty is a specific kind of engagement that is not quite enough to occupy you fully and not quite little enough to ignore. A middle register of cognitive demand that runs continuously without ever reaching the threshold of absorption. You are always partially in the work and partially elsewhere, and the elsewhere is where your actual thinking happens, where you process what's going on, where you make the small decisions that the work requires. When to escalate, when to absorb, when to push back, when to wait, and this parallel processing, maintained across 40 hours a week, across months, becomes its own form of exhaustion. Not the physical exhaustion of the warehouse or the night shift or the road, but a kind of saturation, a feeling at the end of each day that you have been thinking continuously about things that do not accumulate toward anything. That the output of all this processing is a maintained status quo rather than anything built, a building that is kept standing but not extended. Jenny leaves in the 14th month for a role at a competing company that pays her 20% more, which is information she tells you with the lack of ceremony of someone who has made a clean decision and doesn't need affirmation for it, and which you receive with a complicated feeling that is partly happiness for her and partly the awareness that her leaving will produce a redistribution of responsibilities that you can already see coming and that you are not sure you can absorb without the conversation about compensation becoming more urgent. You are right on both counts. The redistribution happens, the conversation becomes more urgent. You have it with Richard, who has it with the partners, who this time do not wait for the annual cycle, but who offer you a title change, senior administrative coordinator, and a salary adjustment to 42,000, which is an increase of 4,000, which is meaningful and which does not bring you to what the position is worth on the open market for someone with 14 months of demonstrated competence at this specific company, but which is a genuine movement in a useful direction. You accept it. You update your LinkedIn without ceremony. You take Jenny's remaining responsibilities into the operating structure of your day and you keep going. There is a moment in the 16th month that you don't mark with any particular awareness at the time, but that you understand later was significant, which is a Tuesday afternoon when Robert Hargreaves calls about a maintenance issue and you resolve it in 6 minutes, start to finish, by knowing which contractor to call and what authority level the issue falls under and what language to use with both Hargreaves and the contractor to align their expectations in a way that doesn't require anyone to be managed in the way of being handled, just in the way of being directed toward the same outcome efficiently. 6 minutes. You put the phone down and you move to the next item in your queue. And it is only later on the commute home that you think about the call and about the first time Hargreaves called in month 2 and the 30 minutes it took you to manage it because you didn't yet know the systems or the contractor relationships or the specific way this particular client needed to be heard before he could be redirected. The distance between those two calls is the distance the job has traveled you without asking, which is how competence accumulates in administrative work quietly, through repetition, in the space between the work you're doing and the work you could do when you arrived, and the gap closes. So gradually you only see it in moments like this one, when the thing that was once hard is now simple, and you remember that it wasn't always. The 2-year mark arrives on a Tuesday, which is appropriate because the job does not observe anniversaries, and neither do you, particularly. But you notice it the way you notice most quiet milestones, with the kind of attention you give to things that matter without requiring ceremony. You are earning 42,000. You are managing the vendor portfolio, the quarterly reports, the partner calendars, the client communications, and a junior admin named Will who joined 3 months ago and who you have been onboarding with the same functional efficiency that Pretty showed you, the same register of information transfer between people who need the information to pass accurately more than warmly. Richard has given you the quarterly reports to present directly to the partners once per cycle, which is not a title change and is not a salary change, but is a real expansion of authority in the room where authority matters. And you do this with the calm of someone who has been producing these reports for 6 quarters and who knows them from the inside rather than the outside. You have begun in month 19 to apply again, not frantically, not with the desperation of $600, but with the specific intentionality of someone who has rebuilt a professional foundation and who is now, for the first time in 2.5 years, applying from a position of employment rather than from the position of not yet employed, which changes everything about the tone of an application and an interview, changes it fundamentally. Because the question you carry into an interview room when you currently have a job is not, please take me, but rather, is this the right next thing? And that question is one that has an answer rather than just a need. And the difference between those two positions is the whole of what the past 2 years have been building toward. You have not yet received an offer from the applications you've sent. You may not receive one soon. The job board continues to produce its listings, and you continue to read them with a calibrated eye of someone who has learned to distinguish between what a role says it is and what it probably is, which is knowledge that costs something to acquire and that the acquisition of is, in its way, the thing the office has given you that you didn't expect to receive from it. The job gave you the vendor contracts and the quarterly reports and the client calls and Richard's process check-ins and the 3% raise and the title change and 40 hours a week of continuous cognitive engagement that didn't accumulate toward anything you could have named at the start, and that has accumulated, in fact, towards something you wouldn't have predicted, which is a professional self that is more durable than the one that left the agency with a box and 6 weeks severance and no clear plan. Your desk still has the mountain wallpaper. You changed it once to a photograph you took on a trip years ago, and then you changed it back because the photograph made you feel something in the middle of the workday that the workday didn't leave you room to feel, and the mountain is neutral, and neutral is a function the desk performs. You sit down every morning and you open the email queue and you begin the triage, and the building fills with its specific population doing its specific work, and you are one more element of the system that keeps it operational, and the day continues. And at 5:30, you close the laptop and you commute, and you come home and you look at the spice rack, which you have finally organized in a way you're satisfied with, and you make something for dinner, and you look at the job listings before you sleep, and in the morning you come back and the queue is full again, and you begin